What if being captured in war was only the beginning of your suffering? What if surviving meant living a life far worse than dying? And what if the men praised as legends in history books were part of one of the darkest systems the ancient world ever created? Today, you're going to hear a story Rome never wanted anyone to remember. A story filled with power, fear, and the voices of captive women who were trapped in a world where they had no freedom, no choices, and nowhere to run. This is the hidden truth of what life was really like for the women held around Roman gladiators, and why so many of them wished for death instead. But to understand how this nightmare began, we must travel far back in time, almost 2,000 years ago. We arrive in the center of the Roman Empire, sometime between the years 100 and 300 AD. During this time, Rome was the strongest power on earth. It controlled huge lands that stretched across many places, from the cold lands of Britain in the north, to the hot deserts of North Africa in the south, and even to the ancient cities of the Middle East in the east. Everywhere you looked, Rome showed its power. Its cities were filled with tall marble buildings, shiny treasures made of gold, and streets built by soldiers who worked endlessly. But these beautiful things were not made peacefully. They were built with hard work, endless battles, and the suffering of countless people. And in the middle of this mighty empire stood Rome's favorite entertainment. It was called the Gladiator Arena. For the Romans, the arena wasn't just entertainment. It was the biggest, wildest, loudest show on earth. Whenever a fight was announced, the entire city seemed to explode with energy. People rushed through the narrow streets, pushing, shouting, laughing, all heading toward the giant stone stadiums that rose high above everything else. Some of these stadiums were so huge that they could hold 50,000 people, the size of a modern football arena. And when those seats filled up, the sound was unbelievable. The crowd roared like a living beast. They shouted, they cheered, they stamped their feet until the ground trembled. The most famous arena of them all was the Colosseum in Rome. And it was so huge, so towering, that to anyone standing at its gates, it felt like staring up at a mountain made of stone. People came from distant towns and far-off provinces just to watch the battles inside it. But behind all the noise and excitement, behind the drums, the music, and the endless cheering, there was another world that most people never saw. A darker world, a hidden world, a world many people were too afraid to speak about. Back then, whenever Rome conquered new lands, it didn't just take gold or territory. Rome took something far more valuable. It took people. Women from many places were captured and carried away. Some came from Gaul, which is modern-day France. Others came from Germania, the land we now call Germany. Some were taken from the beautiful cities of Greece, others from the deserts and rivers of Egypt, and many from Judea, the area we know today as Israel. These women came from all kinds of lives. Some were prisoners taken during battles. Some were regular civilians who had been living normal lives before the soldiers arrived. Some were daughters of defeated kings who suddenly had no power or protection. Others were wives of soldiers who had fallen in war. And some were young teenage girls who had never even seen a battlefield before. Rome had a name for them: spoils of war. To the Romans, this meant they were rewards taken after victory, like objects. But in the real world, they were human beings. They were scared, confused, and heartbroken. They had lost their homes, their families, and their freedom all at once. Many of these women were sent to busy slave markets, where strangers could buy them. Others were taken to special places called gladiator training schools. These schools were known as ludi. And for many of the captured women, their true nightmare began the moment they entered those schools' walls. Gladiator schools were nothing like heroic training centers or fancy gyms. They were more like prisons, cold, strict, and filled with constant fear. The biggest and most famous of all these schools was called the Ludus Magnus. It stood right next to the Colosseum in Rome, so close that you could hear the roar of the crowds from inside its stone walls. Life inside these schools was extremely hard. The fighters lived in small rooms made of stone, almost like tiny jail cells. They were locked in at night, with heavy doors. If they disobeyed their trainers, they were punished. Sometimes they were not given enough food, so they would stay weak and easy to control. Every day they trained, not just to fight, but to either win or die in the arena. There was no middle ground. And the captive women who were sent there had an even harder fate. They were not treated like students or workers with rights. They were treated like items that belonged to the school. People saw them as property, not as living people with feelings, fears, and hopes. These women had to do all the tiring jobs no one else wanted. They cooked meals they never got to enjoy. They cleaned floors and washed clothes. They scrubbed armor, covered in dirt and dried blood after battles. They ran errands and served the same men who fought in front of cheering crowds. But all of this, the cooking, the cleaning, the endless chores, was only the beginning of what they had to endure. In ancient Rome, enslaved women had almost no protection at all. The law did not defend them. The people around them did not listen to them. And the leaders of Rome did not care about their pain. A woman who was owned by a gladiator, a trainer, or an arena official had no choices. She had no right to say no, and no right to run away, no right to complain or ask for fairness. In Rome, power was everything. Whoever had power decided what would happen. Whoever had none had to obey. Some gladiators returned from their fights full of pride, wine, and excitement. Crowds cheered their names. Rich people invited them to parties. They were treated like heroes. But for the women trapped inside the gladiator schools, this glory only made their lives harder. They were forced to listen, to serve, and to do whatever they were ordered. Many captive women were treated as unwilling companions, prize-like belongings, rewards given after victories, objects used to show control and power. If a woman tried to resist or fight back, the punishment was harsh. She could be beaten. She might be denied food. She could be sold to an even crueler owner. Or, in the worst cases, she might be killed, but the school would hide it by calling it discipline. Some Roman writers, like Seneca and Juvenal, left tiny hints about these terrible things. They never wrote the details openly, because Rome hated admitting its own cruelty. Rome recorded its victories proudly, but it hid its shame in silence. Some women became pregnant while living as captives. To Rome, this was not a happy event. A pregnant slave was seen as a problem, not a person with feelings or hopes. If the father of the child was a gladiator who belonged to the school, the woman could face terrible choices. She might be sold to someone else immediately. She could be sent to do even harder work. Or she could be separated from her child forever. What happened to the babies was often just as cruel. Some were sold into slavery. Some were abandoned to survive on their own. And some were kept in the schools to be trained as future gladiators, trapped in the same endless cycle of fighting and fear. Many women were so desperate that they prayed for death rather than give birth into a life of chains and suffering. In some secret cases, arena officials even ordered the killing of babies or mothers to avoid shame or scandal. These deaths were never spoken of. The victims simply vanished, like shadows erased from history, leaving almost no trace of their suffering. The Roman crowds cheered loudly for their heroes, the gladiators in shining armor. They clapped and shouted, amazed by the battles and victories. But the people in the stands never saw the hidden suffering. The women crying quietly in the dark tunnels, the bruises hidden under clothes, the fear that hung in every hallway of the arena. To the public, gladiators were stars, but to the women trapped behind walls, many of those same fighters were living nightmares. Men with swords in their hands and the full power of Roman law protecting them. The same sword that thrilled the crowds with excitement was also a tool that controlled someone's helpless life when no one was watching. Very few women ever managed to escape this world. One rare story comes from a place called Capua, around 73 BC, during the famous revolt led by Spartacus. Spartacus and nearly 70,000 enslaved people rose up, fighting for their freedom. Some captive women ran with them. Many lost their lives during the dangerous rebellion, but a few were able to taste freedom for the very first time in their lives. For most others, Escape remained only a dream, a quiet hope whispered at night, before the chains rattled again at sunrise. Death in the arena could be quick, a sword, a final breath, then silence. But the women who lived behind the scenes suffered for years. They had no choice. They had no safety. They had no hope. They had no voice. Every day was filled with fear. They never knew what the night would bring. This is why some writers from ancient Rome later admitted something shocking. For many captive women, living was worse than dying. History remembers the gladiators as brave fighters. It tells their names and their victories, but it often forgets the silent victims who lived behind the walls. These women had names. They had families. They had dreams. And all of that was swallowed by an empire that called cruelty entertainment. But now their silence is finally broken. Their story is finally told. If you are just seeing us for the first time, or you love what we do, please follow, subscribe, and click the notification bell, so you never miss a single moment in history's wide life. Stay curious. See you in the next chapter.